It's November 11th, 1988, in Sacramento, California. The kind of gray, overcast morning where the whole city feels like it's still half asleep. On F Street, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Victorian-era homes and mature oak trees, a social worker named Judy Moyse is standing on the front porch of a pale blue boarding house, waiting for someone to answer the door. She's been here before. She knows this house. She's referred clients here herself. It's run by a woman named Dorothea Puente, a warm, white-haired grandmother type who charges reasonable rent, cooks hot meals, and takes in people that the rest of the city has largely given up on. The elderly, the mentally ill, people on disability checks and Social Security who have nowhere else to go. Judy is here because one of those people, a 57-year-old schizophrenic man named Alvaro Mozingo, whom everyone calls Bert, hasn't returned her calls in weeks. That's unusual. Bert has his issues, but he's always reliable about checking in. So Judy called ahead, and Dorothea assured her everything was fine, that Bert had simply gone to visit family in Mexico. Except Bert doesn't have family in Mexico. The door opens. Dorothea Puente is standing there in a house dress, hair freshly set, wearing a little lipstick despite the early hour. She smiles warmly, invites Judy in for coffee. The house smells like something is cooking in the kitchen. The living room is tidy, decorated with little figurines and fresh flowers. An elderly man is watching television in the corner. Everything looks, and this is the word that keeps coming back to people who visited this house, normal. Judy asks again about Bert. Dorothea shakes her head sympathetically. Mexico, she says again. She's sure he'll be back soon. Judy Moyse drives away from that house that morning with a feeling she can't quite name. Not fear exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that sits wrong. What she doesn't know as she pulls out of the driveway and heads back to the office is that Bert Mozingo is not in Mexico. Bert Mozingo is in the backyard. And he's not alone. The woman standing in that doorway, radiating warmth and offering coffee and explaining everything away with a patient smile, this woman has been killing her tenants for years, poisoning them slowly, cashing their government checks, and burying them in the garden out back like she was planting bulbs for spring. Her name is Dorothea Puente. And if you want to understand how a 79-pound grandmother became one of the most prolific serial killers in California history, we have to go back, all the way back, to where this story really starts. Dorothea Helen Gray was born on January 9th, 1929, in Redlands, California, the sixth of 18 children. Let that sink in for a second. 18 kids. And even in a family that large, Dorothea managed to fall through the cracks. Her father was an alcoholic who died of tuberculosis when she was 8. Her mother, overwhelmed, barely keeping it together, died shortly after. Dorothea and her siblings were scattered. She ended up in an orphanage, then shuffled between relatives, none of whom particularly wanted her. She learned very early that the world was not going to give her anything she didn't figure out how to take. By the time she was a teenager, Dorothea had developed two things that would define her entire life: an obsession with appearing respectable and a complete willingness to lie to get there. She lied about her age. She lied about her background. She invented a childhood for herself, stable, loving, middle class, and told it so often she almost believed it herself. At 16, she married a soldier named Fred McFall. She was pregnant within months. The first baby died shortly after birth. The second she quietly gave up for adoption. McFall left. She remarried. That husband died. She married again to a man named Axel Johansson, who lived with her on and off for 14 years before she finally tired of him. Through all of this, Dorothea was running scams. Small ones at first, forging checks using stolen identification. In 1960, she's convicted of forgery. In 1968, she's arrested again for managing a brothel. She does time, she gets out, she reinvents herself again. And here's what's remarkable about Dorothea Puente. Every time she walks out of a courtroom or a corrections facility, she doesn't slink away. She rebuilds. She finds a new community. She becomes, almost immediately, someone people trust. She volunteers at churches. She helps elderly neighbors with their groceries. She brings food to people who are sick. She figures out, somewhere along the way, that the best disguise isn't a wig or a fake name. It's a reputation. If people see you as a good person, a generous, maternal, community-minded person, they stop looking at you altogether. By the 1980s, Dorothea Puente has settled into a persona that suits her perfectly: the benevolent landlady. She rents rooms in her large Victorian house at 1426 F Street in Sacramento to people that social service agencies refer to her: difficult cases, people fresh out of mental health facilities, people with substance abuse histories, people whose families have given up on them. She charges them reasonable rent, which she collects along with their benefit checks as their representative payee. That means the government sends the checks directly to her. Her tenants sign them over. She manages their finances. On paper, it's a model of compassionate community housing. Sacramento social workers love her. They send her clients with confidence. They refer to her boarding house as one of the best options in the city for their most vulnerable cases. What none of them know is that Dorothea has already started killing. The first victim investigators would later identify was a man named Everson Gilmuth in 1985. He was 77 years old, and he'd made the mistake of falling in love with Dorothea. He moved in with her. He put her name on his bank accounts, and then he disappeared. Dorothea told people he'd gone on a trip. Meanwhile, she hired a handyman to build a large wooden box. She said it was for storage, and paid him extra to take it out to the river and dump it. The handyman did exactly that. He didn't ask what was inside. Months later, a fisherman along the Sacramento River stumbled across the box. Inside was Everson Gilmuth's body. The case went unsolved. Nobody connected it to Dorothea. She didn't slow down. Between 1986 and 1988, she would poison at least 7 more people inside that house on F Street. Her method was deliberate and methodical. She would get her tenants, most of them elderly, most of them with physical or cognitive impairments, dependent on her for their medication. Then she would introduce drugs into their food or drink: flurazepam, a powerful sedative; diazepam, combinations that, in the doses she used, would kill a person slowly enough that it looked like natural decline. When they died, she'd call on a man named Ismael Flores, the same handyman she'd used for Gilmuth, to help her with what she described as yard work. He dug the holes. He never asked about the lumpy, heavy shapes he was helping to move and cover over. The whole time, Dorothea kept collecting her tenants' checks: Social Security, disability payments, SSI. Some victims had been dead for months while their money kept flowing into her account. And she kept cooking breakfast. Every morning: eggs, bacon, toast. She'd bring plates to the tenants who were still alive. She'd sit with them and drink coffee and talk about the neighborhood, about the weather, about the news. She'd ask after their families. She remembered birthdays. She kept a clean house. Social workers who came to visit left reassured. The tenants they checked on seemed well-fed and comfortable. A few of them, the ones still lucid enough to have opinions, actually raved about Dorothea. She was kind, they said. She really cared. Over 3 years, at least 7 people would be buried in that backyard, and nobody noticed. Here's where this case gets truly maddening, because Dorothea Puente was not unknown to the system, not even close. In 1982, 6 years before her arrest, she was convicted of drugging and stealing from elderly and disabled tenants. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation. One of the conditions of that probation was explicit: she was prohibited from working with elderly or disabled people. She violated that condition almost immediately. Within months of her conviction, she was back at it, renting rooms, taking in the same population she'd been specifically banned from working with. Her probation officer either didn't know or didn't follow up. Then, in 1986, she was convicted again, this time for stealing from a patient she'd been caring for and sentenced to 3 years in prison. She was released after serving less than a year on good behavior. She walked straight back to 1426 F Street. At no point did anyone in the Sacramento criminal justice or social services system connect the dots. Here was a woman with 2 convictions for preying on vulnerable elderly people, operating a boarding house full of vulnerable elderly people, serving as the representative payee for their government benefits. The pieces were all there. Nobody put them together. Part of that is bureaucratic failure. Part of it is something more uncomfortable. Dorothea Puente was extraordinarily good at performing trustworthiness. She donated to political campaigns. She had her photo taken with the mayor. She was on a first-name basis with city council members and county supervisors. She made generous contributions to local charities. She showed up to community events and smiled and shook hands, and everyone shook back. She had built, brick by brick, a fortress of goodwill that took years to penetrate, and the people she was preying on, the mentally ill, the elderly, the addicted, were exactly the people whose complaints, when they surfaced at all, were the easiest to dismiss. One former tenant did try to raise alarms. He told a caseworker he was scared of Dorothea, that things were happening in that house he couldn't explain. The caseworker noted the concern, visited the property. Dorothea gave her a tour, offered tea, talked about the new garden she was putting in. The caseworker filed a report describing the home as well-maintained and the residents as comfortable. The concerned tenant disappeared a few months later. By the fall of 1988, Judy Moyes isn't the only social worker who's noticed something wrong. Several agencies have clients at 1426 F Street who've gone quiet, not responding to calls, not showing up for appointments, not renewing their benefit paperwork. When caseworkers follow up with Dorothea, the explanations are always the same: traveling, moved to stay with family, checked themselves into a program somewhere, always somewhere else, always unreachable. Judy Moyes goes back to 1426 F Street on November 14, 1988, 3 days after her first visit, this time with a police detective named John Cabrera. They're there specifically to ask about Bert Mozingo. Dorothea answers the door in the same easy, welcoming way. Coffee? Of course. Come in. Detective Cabrera is polite. He doesn't come in with accusations. He just asks questions, and he watches Dorothea the whole time. The way she moves, the way she pauses before answering, the way her hands stay completely still when most people's wouldn't. He asks if he can look around the yard. Just a routine check, he says. Dorothea hesitates for just a fraction of a second. Then she smiles and says, of course. The yard is large, well kept. There are flower beds along the fence line, vegetable patches near the back wall, a tool shed, and freshly turned earth in several spots that don't quite match the rest of the garden. Detective Cabrera notes the locations and calls for a forensic team. 2 days later, on November 11th, the same morning Judy had first come by, investigators begin digging. The first body turns up within hours, then a second, then a third. By the time they reached 7 bodies on the property, news cameras have set up across the street and the whole country is watching. And Dorothea Puente is gone. On the morning of the first excavation, while detectives were busy at the back of the property, she asked one of the officers if she could walk down the street to get a cup of coffee at the Clarion Hotel. She wasn't under arrest. She wasn't officially a suspect. She was just the homeowner, cooperating with the investigation. The officer said yes. Dorothea walked out the front door with her purse, in a salmon-pink dress and low heels, and disappeared into the city. By the time anyone thought to look for her, she was on a bus to Los Angeles. She made it to the Greyhound station. She made it to L.A. She checked into a budget hotel in the Skid Row area and started working her magic on the regulars at a nearby bar, introducing herself as a retired businesswoman. chatting up a retired carpenter named Charles Wilgus, telling him her name was Dorothea Monroe. She was 79 years old, alone, and on the run, and she was still performing. But the story was everywhere. Every TV in that bar was showing the coverage from Sacramento. And Charles Wilgus, the retired carpenter who'd been buying drinks for this friendly older woman, recognized her face on the screen. He called the police. On November 17, 1988, 6 days after she walked out of her own house while investigators dug up her yard, Dorothea Puente was arrested at the Monte Carlo bar in Los Angeles. She was calm. She said she understood. She asked if she could finish her drink. At her trial, Dorothea Puente maintained that she hadn't killed anyone, that her tenants had died of natural causes and she'd simply panicked and buried them herself because she was afraid of getting in trouble. It was a defense that required the jury to believe she had, entirely by coincidence, experienced 9 natural deaths among her tenants over a 3-year period and had responded to each one by dragging the body into the yard at night and digging a hole. The jury didn't buy it. In 1993, she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution had sought the death penalty. The jury deadlocked on that question. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She died at the Central California Women's Facility on March 27, 2011. She was 82 years old. She maintained her innocence to the end. There were rumors she'd been writing a cookbook from her cell. Of course there were. 9 people. 9 people who were sent to 1426 F Street by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Social workers, caseworkers, probation officers, each one doing their piece of the job, none of them seeing the whole picture. That's not entirely their fault. The system wasn't designed to track a pattern like this, a predator who operated across multiple agencies, who weaponized the gap between them. But it's also not a coincidence that every single one of Dorothea's victims was someone the world had already decided to look away from. People with mental illness, people with addiction, people aging alone without family to advocate for them. The people who are hardest to protect are almost always the ones nobody's paying that much attention to. What I keep coming back to is Judy Moyes. She had one conversation with Dorothea, and something told her to come back. She had no proof, no specific evidence, just a feeling she couldn't shake. She went back with a detective. She insisted. Because of that, the excavation started. Because of that, 7 families got answers. 7 sets of remains came out of that backyard and were returned to people who'd been wondering for years what happened. That matters. It doesn't undo anything, but it matters. Take care of yourselves and check in on the people around you who might not have anyone else doing it. If you're concerned about the welfare of an elderly or vulnerable adult in your community, contact the Elder Care Locator at 1-800-677-1116. For adult protective services in your state, visit eldercare.acl.gov. If someone is in immediate danger, call 911.